My name is Liam, and at 28, my existence is defined by the relentless rhythmic grind of physical labor. Every morning at 6 a.m., the world is a cold, damp blur of grey light as I climb into my aging Ford truck, the engine turning over with a reluctant groan that matches my own. My fuel is simple: black coffee, swallowed bitter and scalding from a dented thermos while I navigate the rain-slicked outskirts of Seattle. On the job site, my identity is stripped down to my utility belt and the grit beneath my fingernails. I spend my hours framing the skeletons of houses or smoothing wet concrete, lost in a sea of sawdust, sweat, and the sharp scent of fresh pine. By the time the sun dips behind the clouds, I am physically spent, my muscles humming with a dull ache that has become my most constant companion. Home is a minimalist refuge, a tiny apartment that feels more like a converted garage than a living space. It's a cramped corner of the world where the kitchenette smells of old takeout and the floorboards complain under every step. There are no luxuries here, no grand decorations, and certainly no 5-year plan. I live in a state of day-to-day survival, earning just enough to settle the bills and keep a few dollars aside for a Friday night beer with the crew. For a long time, I convinced myself that this simplicity was enough. The true weight of my life, however, wasn't the work. It was the silence. 2 years had passed since I last attempted to date, not because of a dramatic heartbreak, but because of a profound, bone-deep exhaustion. I grew tired of the performative nature of meeting someone new, the scripted small talk, the forced laughter, and the way women would look at me as if I were a fixer-upper with a cracked foundation. I grew weary of being sized up for my lack of ambition or status. Eventually, the sting of being ghosted or politely dismissed became too much to bother with. I retreated into a fortress of solitude, deciding that being alone was safer than being misunderstood. I had settled into a survival mode of isolation, becoming a ghost in my own life, until the world finally decided to knock on my door. The walls I had built around my quiet life were thick, but they weren't strong enough to withstand Maya. As my oldest friend, she possessed a unique ability to see through my contentment and recognize it for what it truly was: a slow fade into nothingness. Over the phone, her voice was a mixture of sharp frustration and genuine love as she called me a hermit and demanded I rejoin the living. She didn't ask, she bargained, promising a month of beer if the blind date she'd arranged turned into a disaster. I agreed, not out of hope, but out of a desperate need to silence her persistent concern. The meeting place was a tucked-away cafe at the end of a cobblestone street, a cozy sanctuary of exposed brick and mismatched furniture that felt miles away from the jagged edges of a construction site. The air was thick with the comforting aroma of roasted beans and a faint trace of cinnamon. I arrived 10 minutes early, a hardwired habit from a job where time is money, and took a strategic seat by the window. I spent those minutes mentally rehearsing my exit strategy, polishing a polite early start tomorrow excuse that would allow me to bolt back to my solitude at the first sign of awkwardness. Then the door swung open and Laura walked in. She didn't enter with the confidence of someone looking for a fairy tale. She stepped inside like someone bracing for impact. She was around 30, with shoulder-length brown hair and a posture that suggested she was trying to take up as little space as possible. When our eyes met, she offered a nod that was more of a truce than a greeting. As she sat down, the conversation began with the standard hollow questions of a first encounter. She spoke of her work as a nurse in a burn unit, her voice steady but her eyes guarded, while I described the satisfaction of seeing a house rise from the dirt. Suddenly, the superficiality vanished. The air in the cafe seemed to crystallize as Laura stopped mid-sentence and looked down at her sleeve. With a deliberate, matter-of-fact motion, she rolled back the fabric to reveal the truth she'd been carrying: a complex, permanent tapestry of raised burn scars that snaked from her wrist into the darkness of her shirt. It was raw, honest, and undeniably painful to look at. She didn't blink as she told me that most people didn't want to date someone like her. It was a test, a deliberate hurdle placed in front of me to see if I would stumble or flee. The cafe's background noise, the hiss of the espresso machine, the clinking of porcelain faded into a dull hum. I looked at the scars, and then I looked at her. In that moment, I didn't see a tragedy. I saw a mirror of my own internal weathering. Without a word, I reached across the table and gently pulled her sleeve back down, covering the scars with a touch of quiet respect. I met her gaze and told her, with a steadiness that surprised even me, that I wasn't going anywhere. I knew then that if I walked out that door, I would be leaving behind the only real thing I'd found in years. The silence that followed was no longer the heavy, suffocating kind I'd grown used to in my apartment. It was a necessary bridge. Laura's eyes searched mine, looking for the flicker of pity or the inevitable polite exit. But she found only a reflection of her own resilience. Sensing that the pretense had finally evaporated, she began to speak, her voice dropping into a low, rhythmic cadence that suggested she was recounting a story etched into her soul. She told me of a night 4 years ago in downtown Seattle, a normal evening of takeout and bad television with her visiting parents, that ended in the acrid stench of smoke and the roar of an electrical fire. She described the hallway as a tunnel of flame and the agonizing heat of a burning railing that caught her arm as she fought to reach her parents' room. The weight of her survival was heavy. She had been closer to the exit, a fluke of geography that left her with life-altering scars while the two people she loved most were lost to the smoke. She spoke of the grueling year that followed, the skin grafts that felt like torture, and the mirrors she avoided for months because the woman staring back looked like a stranger. It was a confession of survivor's guilt and physical pain, delivered with the raw detachment of someone who had survived a war only to find the peace just as difficult to navigate. Her honesty acted as a magnet, pulling my own hidden truths to the surface. I found myself telling her about growing up in the shadows of these very suburbs, the son of a mechanic and a house cleaner. I spoke of the quiet shame of hand-me-down clothes and the pervasive feeling that I was always half a step behind the world. I admitted that my simple life was often a shield. I told her how I'd spent years retreating from relationships the moment things became real, terrified that once people saw the cracks in my foundation, my lack of status or my internal weariness, they would leave anyway. I confessed that I usually sabotaged things early just to save myself the hassle of being discarded later. As the yellow lights of the cafe hummed above us, we realized we were two people defined by different types of fire. Hers was literal, leaving marks on her skin. Mine was a slow burn of inadequacy that had left marks on my spirit. For the first time in my life, I wasn't being sized up for my potential or my paycheck. We were just two survivors sitting amidst the scent of coffee and cinnamon, acknowledging that the world had been unkind to us both, but that we were still sitting there, breathing, and finally, truly talking. In the weeks that followed, our connection didn't explode into a whirlwind romance. Instead, it settled into a quiet, reliable rhythm, much like the steady pace of a long-term construction project. We exchanged numbers, but our communication was sparse and intentional. Short texts about the grey Seattle skyline or a simple check-in after a long shift. We began meeting in neutral, low-pressure spaces, a park tucked behind an industrial district, or a bench overlooking a murky pond near my job site. These were places where we could just be, away from the scrutinizing eyes of the city. I'd bring thick sandwiches from a local deli, and she'd arrive with coffee, our conversations meandering from light-hearted work stories to the heavy silences that no longer felt uncomfortable. However, the armor Laura wore was more than just metaphorical. Even as the humidity of late summer lingered, she remained buttoned up to the chin, her long sleeves acting as a physical barrier between her history and the world. I watched the subconscious tugging of her cuffs whenever a stranger walked too close, a reflexive defense against the perceived judgment of the public. She admitted during a walk along the waterfront that she felt like a walking tragedy in the eyes of others, either a source of pity or an object of morbid curiosity. To her, the fabric was safety. It was the only thing that allowed her to move through a crowd without feeling exposed. I countered her caution with a version of myself I hadn't known existed, a man with infinite patience. I never asked her to uncover, and I never pushed for more than she was willing to give. My support was found in the things I didn't say. When she went silent for a few days after a particularly draining shift at the hospital, I didn't demand explanations. I simply sent a message letting her know I was there when she was ready to resurface. I was learning that being a partner didn't mean fixing her discomfort, but rather providing a space where that discomfort didn't have to be hidden from me. Our friendship became a series of small, hard-won victories. We were two people practicing the art of being seen without the fear of being rejected. I began to realize that my own walls, the ones I'd built to hide my lack of ambition and my blue-collar roots, were lowering alongside hers. We were testing the waters of vulnerability, finding that the more we revealed of our cracked foundations, the more stable the ground beneath us actually became. We were no longer just two individuals in survival mode. We were becoming a team, cautiously stepping out from behind our respective shields. The turning point arrived on a crisp Saturday morning at a community center where I was volunteering for a charity build. We were constructing a specialized playground, a space designed with shaded retreats and soft, non-abrasive surfaces for children who, like Laura, were recovering from severe burns. I had invited her tentatively, fully expecting her to decline, but to my surprise, she appeared at the edge of the site just as the sun began to break through the clouds. My heart hammered against my ribs when I saw her. For the first time, she wasn't wearing her armor. She was in a short-sleeved yellow t-shirt, her scars fully exposed to the daylight. She looked terrified, her posture stiff as she scanned the crowd of volunteers and families, but she was there. The atmosphere was a chaotic symphony of hammers hitting nails and the high-pitched laughter of children. As Laura approached, the initial reaction from the adults was predictable. A few lingering gazes followed by the polite, hurried look away that she hated most. But the children were different. A small group of them, some with their own pressure garments or visible bandages, gravitated toward her with the blunt, honest curiosity of youth. One little boy stopped mid-stride, pointing at her arm with wide eyes. He didn't see a tragedy, he saw a reflection. "You have them too," he whispered, holding up a hand marked by similar grafts. Laura froze for a split second, her eyes darting to me in a silent plea for help. I stayed back, offering only a steady nod that said, "You've got this." Slowly, she knelt down to his level, the tension draining from her shoulders. "I do," she said, her voice growing stronger as she spoke. "These are my battle scars. I fought a fire, and I won. They're like a map of how brave I had to be." The children crowded around her, touching her skin with reverence rather than pity, asking if she was a superhero or a fire princess. In that moment, the shame that had dictated her life for 4 years began to transmute into something else, a source of profound connection and empowerment. I watched from the scaffolding, a heavy beam in my hands, as she spent the afternoon laughing and signing the casts of the kids. She wasn't just surviving anymore, she was leading. Seeing her in that light, vibrant and unapologetic, I realized that her scars weren't a sign of what had been broken, but a testament to what couldn't be destroyed. Her strength was more solid than any house I had ever framed, and I knew then that the woman standing in the center of that playground was the most beautiful person I had ever known. We left the site that evening tired and covered in dust, but for the first time, the weight she carried felt significantly lighter. The momentum of that summer came to a sudden jarring halt in early autumn. Life has a way of testing a foundation just as you think it's set. And for us, the storm arrived not as a conflict between us, but as a collapse within Laura. I had just finished a grueling 12-hour shift, my body coated in a fine layer of drywall dust. When my phone buzzed with a call from the hospital, it wasn't Laura, it was one of her colleagues. She had collapsed during a double shift, the physical strain of her job finally colliding with the emotional weight of a particularly difficult pediatric case that had mirrored her own trauma too closely. I drove through the rain-slicked streets of Seattle in a haze of adrenaline and fear, my truck's wipers struggling against the downpour. When I reached her room, the vibrant woman from the playground was gone, replaced by someone who looked small and shattered beneath the harsh clinical glow of hospital lights. She was hooked to an IV, her face pale, her eyes brimming with a mixture of exhaustion and profound shame. As I sat by her bed, she turned away, her voice cracking as she confessed her deepest fear, that she was too broken to be loved, and that by seeing her in this state, weak, weeping, and unable to hold herself together, I would finally realize she was a burden and walk away. She spilled out years of suppressed grief, the nightmares that still woke her up in a cold sweat, the hollow ache of missing her parents, and the crushing pressure she felt to be the strong one for her patients. I didn't try to offer platitudes or fix her grief with empty words. Instead, I simply took her scarred hand in mine and stayed. I stayed through the long, quiet hours of the night. I stayed when the nurses came to change her fluids. I stayed when she had nothing left to say. I told her that I wasn't there for a polished, perfect version of her. I was there for the whole person, the strength and the scars, the resilience and the collapse. That week in the hospital transformed our relationship from a series of dates into a true partnership. It was in that sterile room that Laura realized my commitment wasn't conditional on her being okay. I navigated the logistics of her discharge, brought her herbal tea, and read to her from a battered paperback to drown out the hum of the monitors. I proved to her, through the simple act of showing up every morning, that her vulnerability wasn't a reason for me to leave. It was the very thing that made me want to stay. We emerged from the hospital walls with a new understanding. We didn't have to be whole to be worthy of one another. We just had to be honest. After her release from the hospital, the boundaries between our separate lives began to dissolve, replaced by a shared terrain of trust. The first real invitation into her inner sanctum happened at her apartment, a space I had previously only seen from the threshold. She led me to a heavy door at the end of a narrow hallway, her studio. When she flipped the switch, I was met with an explosion of color and pain. The walls were lined with canvases that told the story her words sometimes couldn't. There were abstract depictions of hands woven with silver threads to represent scars and faces emerging from dark, swirling tempests into flickers of golden light. It was raw, visceral, and beautiful. In that room, I saw that Laura hadn't just been surviving. She had been translating her trauma into something transcendent. My praise wasn't for her technique, but for the courage it took to stare at her own reflection until she found the art within it. The final piece of our integration was a journey back to my roots. I took Laura to the small, weathered town an hour east of Seattle to meet my mother. I had spent my life feeling less than because of our humble circumstances, and I was terrified of how these two worlds would collide. My mother's house was a modest place, smelling of wood smoke and dried wildflowers. As we pulled into the gravel driveway, my anxiety peaked, but it was hollow. My mother didn't see a burn victim or a stranger. She saw the woman who had finally brought the light back into her son's eyes. She bypassed all the awkward questions, pulling Laura into a fierce hug and acknowledging her strength with a simple, "Liam told me you were a fighter. I like fighters." That afternoon on the porch, watching them talk over slices of homemade pie, the last of my own insecurities withered away. I realized that acceptance wasn't about being perfect or having a prestigious title. It was about being seen by people who understood the value of a person's spirit. Laura wasn't an outsider in my world, and I wasn't a fixer-upper in hers. We were simply two people who had found home in one another. The external validation from my mother and the internal revelation of her art studio served as the final beams in the structure we were building. We were no longer two separate stories. We were becoming a single cohesive narrative of endurance. Our life now is not a fairy tale of sudden healing, but a testament to the beauty of a slow, steady rebuild. The new normal we've established is anchored in the quiet moments that once felt impossible. A shared breakfast in my slightly less cramped apartment, or the comfortable silence of a Tuesday evening when the only sound is the rain tapping against the glass. I still spend my days on construction sites, but the physical ache in my muscles feels lighter because I know whose hand I'll be holding when the sun goes down. Laura continues her work at the hospital, but she no longer carries the weight of her patient's trauma as if it were hers alone to bear. We have become each other's decompression chamber, a safe harbor where the world's noise finally stops. We still have our difficult days' shadows that flicker when a fire siren wails in the distance, or when the old feelings of inadequacy creep into my mind during a slow work week. But the difference is that we no longer retreat into our separate fortresses of solitude. We've learned that being settled doesn't mean the scars have disappeared. It means they no longer dictate the direction of our lives. Laura wears her short sleeves now without a second thought, her skin a map of a journey we both respect. We've even started a small tradition of hosting art nights for the kids from the community center, turning her studio into a place where others can learn that their cracks are actually where the light shines through most brightly. Standing on the balcony of her apartment as the Seattle skyline begins to twinkle, I realize that my old survival guide has been replaced by something much more profound. We don't need a grand 5-year plan or a life of luxury to feel successful. We have found a rare kind of peace in our shared resilience, a quiet, unshakable understanding that as long as we keep showing up for one another, the foundation will hold. We aren't fixed and we aren't perfect, but we are together. And in a world that often feels like it's falling apart, having someone to walk through the wreckage with is the greatest victory of all. The fog has finally lifted, and for the first time in my life, I can see exactly where I'm going.